Regina Holt stood at the edge of Eleanor Voss's cornfield holding a stack of violation notices thick enough to choke a filing cabinet. She was certain a 74-year-old widow with a tractor and a shotgun-shaped mailbox post would fold within the month. She had no idea that the deed beneath her own house, the clubhouse she'd spent 2 years fighting to build, and the private road she drove every morning all answered to a single trust, and that the trust answered to the grandson standing behind Eleanor at every hearing, saying nothing, taking notes. 3 months later, Regina would stand in a conference room stripped of every title she'd ever given herself, staring at a signature on a master deed that read Caleb Voss. She finally understood. She had spent a year finding the one family in Sterling Meadows who could erase her association with a single phone call. Briarwood Hollow had been Voss land since 1958. 41 acres of corn, hayfields, and a farmhouse Eleanor's late husband had built board by board. When the Merrow Development Group carved Sterling Meadows out of the surrounding pasture 15 years ago, they built 300 homes, 2 lakes, and a golf course around Eleanor's farm, without ever touching it. The reason sat buried in a filing cabinet nobody at the HOA had ever bothered to read: an original purchase agreement granting Briarwood Hollow permanent easement rights and full exemption from association bylaws. In exchange for the right-of-way Eleanor's husband had once sold the developer for the community's main entrance road. For over a decade, nobody at Sterling Meadows cared. Eleanor grew her tomatoes, sold eggs at a folding table by the mailboxes, and nodded politely at joggers who passed her fence line. Then Regina Holt won the board presidency by 9 votes, and the first thing she did was drive past Briarwood Hollow and decide that a working farm sitting inside a luxury community was, in her words, a liability nobody signed up for. The first fine arrived within a week: $600 for an unpermitted structure, meaning Eleanor's decades-old chicken coop. Eleanor called the office and was told the fine would double if unpaid within 10 days. She mailed a copy of her deed instead. Regina mailed back a letter insisting the association's design guidelines applied to any visible structure within community sightlines, a clause that existed nowhere in the covenants and never would. The fines kept coming after that, each one stranger than the last: a citation for unauthorized livestock odor, a citation for a tractor improperly stored in her own barn, a citation for a scarecrow the landscaping committee decided violated the seasonal decor policy. Eleanor never paid a single one. Instead, she photographed every notice, dated every envelope, and mailed copies to a grandson 2 states away who told her, calmly, to keep everything and change nothing. Caleb had grown up summers at Briarwood Hollow. He'd built his career since in commercial real estate, acquiring land trusts and master leaseholds most people never think to ask about. When Merrow Development had gone bankrupt 8 years earlier, its remaining assets, including the underlying master deed to every parcel inside Sterling Meadows, the ground lease beneath the clubhouse, and the reversionary rights to the private roads, had been sold off in a portfolio nobody in the neighborhood had ever heard mentioned. Caleb bought it. He acquired the whole portfolio through a holding company called Ashgrove Capital, for reasons that had nothing to do with his grandmother at the time. He simply never told anyone in Sterling Meadows who owned the ground their houses sat on, because nobody had ever asked. Regina escalated exactly the way people with unearned confidence always do. She recruited 2 board allies to reassess Briarwood Hollow's boundary at a private meeting Eleanor was never invited to attend, then announced at the next open session that the farm's exemption had lapsed due to non-renewal, a status that existed nowhere in any filing. When Eleanor's attorney requested the paperwork proving any such lapse, Regina produced nothing, and instead accused Eleanor of hiding behind lawyers to avoid community standards. A few residents who had known Eleanor for years quietly objected, but most stayed silent, unwilling to become the board's next target, and one longtime neighbor named Duane Pratt later admitted he'd started parking his truck farther from her fence line simply to avoid being seen talking to her. The harassment turned physical within weeks. Landscaping crews began mowing strips of Eleanor's hayfield under the excuse of maintaining sightlines. A gate chain was cut in the night. And one morning Eleanor woke to find survey stakes driven 6 feet inside her boundary, marking what Regina had already started calling, in emails to the board, future clubhouse expansion parcel B. Caleb flew in the following weekend. He said almost nothing to Regina directly and spent 3 days walking the property with a surveyor of his own, cross-referencing every stake against the recorded plat. He found what he expected. The association had never once obtained legal grounds to touch the boundary, and the survey stakes traced a shape that matched, almost exactly. The footprint of a resort clubhouse rendering Regina had shown the board 8 months earlier. At the next community meeting, Regina stood before 200 residents. She announced that Briarwood Hollow's fines had climbed past $40,000 and that the board would be filing for a lien against the property within the week unless the family finally showed some willingness to cooperate with the community's future. She looked directly at Caleb when she said it, mistaking his silence for weakness. He asked only one question in response: whether the association had reviewed the master deed before authorizing that lien. Regina said the deed was a marrow relic that hadn't mattered in years. The room went quiet. Trevor Aldon, the association's attorney, looked visibly uncomfortable, though nobody understood why until the following month. Inside the community's own clubhouse conference room, the one Regina had personally championed, the lien hearing convened on land she had never once questioned the ownership of. She arrived with a folder of fabricated boundary documents and a prepared statement calling Eleanor an obstacle to progress the entire neighborhood deserved to move past. Caleb arrived last, carrying nothing but a single envelope. He asked the acting mediator to enter one document into record before any vote was taken: the recorded master deed for all of Sterling Meadows, filed with the county nearly a decade earlier, showing Ash Grove Capital Caleb Voss, sole managing member, as the holder of the ground lease beneath every home, the clubhouse, and the private roads the association had not legally owned outright. Regina's face went the color of drywall. Trevor Aldon closed his folder without being asked. Caleb stated plainly, for the record, that the association's authority over any resident had always been conditioned on a ground lease it did not control, that the lease could be terminated for cause under a clause the board had missed entirely, and that harassment of a tenant holding a permanent exemption easement constituted exactly that cause. He didn't destroy Sterling Meadows. Instead, he dissolved the board, installed an independent property manager under the lease's existing terms, and voided every fine ever issued against Briarwood Hollow. The clubhouse expansion died quietly on paper, the same way it had been born there. Regina resigned within the month rather than face a lease termination hearing that would have exposed the falsified survey to the entire county. The two board allies who had helped her back date the boundary review resigned days later, unwilling to have their names attached to what the county records office was already reviewing. Eleanor kept her tomatoes and her folding table by the mailboxes. Residents who'd once crossed the street to avoid the difficult farm lady started stopping to buy eggs instead, once they understood who'd been standing behind her the whole time. Dwayne Pratt was among the first, and he never mentioned the truck. Under the new management structure, every fine over $100 required a documented reason and a resident's signature acknowledging it, a rule the interim manager credited directly to what had happened at Briarwood Hollow. Eleanor never moved, and she never renovated. She mentioned the master deed to a neighbor only when asked directly, which almost none of them did. Caleb visited most weekends. He helped her mend fence posts that had nothing to do with any boundary dispute, and he kept the stack of old violation notices in a drawer at his office, not as trophies, but as a reminder of how easily a woman who had done nothing wrong could have lost everything to people who never checked, who actually owned the ground beneath their own feet. Someone asked Caleb once, months later over the fence line, how it felt to finally beat Regina Holt. He said he hadn't beaten anyone. He'd simply owned the ground she was standing on the entire time, and all he'd ever had to do was wait for her to notice.